The afternoon sun painted the dining table gold when I took the lemon tart from the oven. The scent of rosemary and baked butter softening the kitchen the way a hymn softens a church. I had folded the laundry, wiped the baseboards, taped my grandson's watercolor clouds back onto the fridge where the tape always gave way. And I was still drying my hands on the dish towel when the front door opened. Claire's heels struck the wood with intention. A quick, decisive rhythm that rarely arrived with kindness. She walked in, took in the tart, and gave me a narrow smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said I didn't need to do that, and the words might have sounded polite to someone who didn't know better. I know better. I said I thought it might help because they'd been busy, and she cut across my sentence like a knife through soft pastry. That was the problem. She said, I always thought I needed to do things no one had asked me to do. She set her phone on the table I had just polished, draped her coat over the chair I had dusted, and breathed out a sentence that had been rehearsed. This arrangement wasn't working. My mouth went dry, though the words were familiar. The kind you hear long before anyone dares to speak them. She called the house our home, but not mine. Said she and Daniel had been talking. Said it was time for me to find somewhere else. I repeated the phrase as if it were a foreign language, some delicate script I would smear if I touched it. She softened and called it independence, wrapped eviction in gift paper and tied it with a ribbon of mercy. I turned because she'd said Daniel's name. And there he was on the edge of the couch, eyes pinned to his phone, a statue carved from silence. He didn't look at me. He didn't say my name. It hurt more than shouting because shouting means you were seen. I thought about the long ledger of my quiet life in that house. All the sums no one recorded. I had paid the extra $12,000 when their down payment fell short. I had covered utilities when layoffs made weekends long and sleep thin. The furniture she circled in glossy catalogs stood in the living room because half the cost came from the savings Henry left when he died. None of it mattered in that moment. Claire tilted her head and said it wasn't personal and added a timeline that sounded like kindness until the end of the month before stepping away, as if the terrible part were done and the practical part could now proceed. I looked at my son one last time. He stood, mumbled something about work emails, and left the room as if grief were a draft he could shut out by closing a door. I covered the tart with foil and climbed the stairs to the room they called the spare. Sometimes the office. Never mine. I took down the suitcase I had carried to Henry's funeral and folded my life into it with a care no one would notice, because noticing was not a skill valued in that home. The television downstairs washed the rooms in laugh-track warmth while I placed sweaters and letters and the photograph of Henry's hand over mine into a neat row of private artifacts. Resentment didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like frost. Quiet and sure, and by the time you see it, the cold has already settled in the glass. I lay awake through a night that hummed with the heater I paid to install. And when the first gray of morning made the blinds glow, I didn't cry. I decided. I made coffee, left the tart in the fridge, and opened my accounts. Mortgage assistance, property tax offsets, insurance copays, the emergency maintenance fund, every valve I had opened to keep their life warm and lit. I turned them off with a firm hand and an easy wrist. Real consequences don't need an audience. I packed my last book. The letter Henry wrote at the end thanking me for holding what felt unholdable, and stepped into a day that felt suddenly weightless. The lawn I had weeded by hand was silver with dew. The air smelled like lemon and something sour I hadn't noticed until I was free of it. And the house behind me looked like a photograph someone else cared about. The motel room held a different kind of silence. one that didn't demand a trade. Beige walls, a wooden dresser, a tilted mirror, and a heater that sounded like a small animal purring. None of it knew my name, and none of it asked me to disappear in exchange for peace. I sat on the bed, cardigan clutched at the chest like a hand to a wound, and let the tears come without performance. They weren't loud, they were steady, like the rain that brushed the window in silver strokes. I thought about the first time I had felt the low hum of disregard, the warm lunch that went unthanked, the careful note he shrugged off because the cafeteria had pizza. Not cruelty, then carelessness. But carelessness grows if you feed it. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't careless. She was precise. She loved the word proper, as if my years of running a home had been a rehearsal for her corrections. I had stopped running the dishwasher because I preferred the quiet to her commentary. I had stayed in the spare room when her friends came over because I preferred invisibility to her embarrassment. I had allowed their comfort to be purchased with my erasure. And then I wondered why I felt like a ghost. I slept in starts and fits and woke to the pale honesty of a room that did not lie about what I was to it, a woman renting a night, and owed nothing but the key. I made a list on motel stationery, nothing grand, only truths I could keep. Begin again. Buy bread for myself. Step outside at dawn and breathe. Keep the money I would have given away. Call my life by my own name. Snow began to fall the morning I realized I wouldn't go back. Not for Sunday dinner. Not for Ethan's birthday. Not even to collect the last of the things they would eventually box up without me. It started softly, as if the sky were exhaling, then thickened by midday into a white sheet that erased the edges of the world. I sat in the rental cottage I had found just a town away, sipping tea from a chipped mug, the steam clouding the window as the street outside turned into a page without lines. The cottage was small. The floors creaked. The stove carried a faint smell of cinnamon whenever it warmed up. But it was mine. That word, simple and firm, anchored me more than any mortgage statement I had ever paid on someone else's behalf. At 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message. Claire's name lit up the screen, and I almost ignored it. But old habits die reluctantly. Her text was brisk Ethan's party at 2:00 p.m. today. Hope you can make it. Don't forget the cupcakes. No apology. No recognition of the exile she had orchestrated 3 weeks earlier. Just an expectation, delivered with the assumption that I was still available, still eager, still orbiting their sun. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I set the phone down, lit a candle, and watched the flame bend gently in the quiet. I made no cupcakes. I let the snow fall. Later, the phone rang. Daniel this time. His voice was softer, almost hesitant, but the words still stumbled over the same blind spots. Mom, about the heating bill? Apparently that was under your name, or at least you'd been paying it. Claire's a little stressed. Could you give me a call? We'll talk. Okay. His tone carried a strange mix of plea and assumption, as if he couldn't quite decide if I was still the safety net he had always fallen into. I listened, but when the message ended, I didn't call back. The rage I once expected never came. Only clarity. I had been scaffolding, invisible, but vital, and now without me the house trembled. The messages kept coming. Claire's tone turned brittle, layered with accusation. She said Ethan missed me, that my silence was punishing them, that whatever I was doing wasn't fair. The word punished echoed like a misfired bullet. Setting boundaries wasn't punishment, it was survival. Yet to Claire, my absence could only be an act of war because she had never considered my presence as anything but service. I let her words float into the air unanswered, and when they settled, I felt no guilt, only relief. A week later, a letter arrived in Daniel's handwriting, uneven and rushed the way it had been when he was a boy. He wrote that things had been rough, that maybe they hadn't thought things through, that perhaps they had handled it badly. He said, "We miss you," signed it with love. I read the words slowly, again and again, letting each phrase unfold its evasions. We hadn't asked you to leave exactly. We didn't think it through. We forgot. Forgetting a person is not an accident. Forgetting is a choice dressed as ignorance. I folded the letter and placed it on the table. I did not throw it away, but I did not answer. What they missed wasn't me. It was the services I provided. That evening, I made lentil soup in my own kitchen, stirred in time until the steam smelled of patience. I sat by the window and watched the last of the snow slip into the earth. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply felt still, for the first time in years. My silence was not the price of belonging. It was the proof of my freedom. Days passed. The phone quieted. The letters slowed. The absence of their voices filled my cottage with a rare kind of peace. I found the old notebook Henry once teased me about, the one where I wrote down dreams when I thought I still had time for them. At the back was a list: visit Florence, take a watercolor class, bake bread from scratch, see the ocean in winter, wake up one morning with no alarm and no plan. I smiled and added a new line: start tomorrow. The next morning, I baked a loaf of bread. Rosemary and sea salt kneaded into the crust. The cottage smelled warm, alive, like a home that existed for no one's convenience but mine. When the voicemail icon lit again, I pressed play almost out of curiosity. Claire's voice, polished but cracked at the edges, filled the small room. She said the mortgage company had called. There was an issue with the automatic payments. She thought I was still covering it. Could I check? She didn't end with "we miss you." Didn't ask if I was all right. Only wrapped her request in the tone of someone confident I was still her quiet safety net. I deleted the message without saving. That night, I walked through the snow, the flakes catching in my hair, the world soft and white around me. For once, I didn't think of their house or their bills or their silence. I thought only of the sound of my own steps crunching across the street, and how each one felt like a sentence finally spoken after years of swallowing words. I went to bed in the cottage, the bread cooling on the counter, and dreamed not of eviction, but of oceans. The first real shift came in the form of an envelope. Not a bill, not a demand, not a clipped voicemail, but a plain white envelope slipped through the mail slot with my name written in careful block letters. The handwriting was uneven, a child's attempt at neatness. Inside was a card painted in soft blue strokes of watercolor. Waves spilling across the page, beneath the brush marks, written slowly and earnestly, were the words, "I hope you see the ocean soon. I miss you. Love, Ethan." I sat at the small table in my cottage, the afternoon light bending through the window, and held that card as if it were a relic. There was no note from Claire, no command attached, no assumption of service, just a boy's hand, uncertain and honest. For the first time in weeks, something stirred in me that wasn't cold. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was real. I took out a pen and wrote a reply. I told him I had seen the ocean, that it was blue and wide and soft all at once, and that his card meant more than he knew. I signed it simply, "Love, Grandma." No phone number, no return address. Just a gift as small and as true as his had been. The next week, I walked the coastal cliffs. the wind tugging at my coat, the sea roaring below. I let myself imagine Ethan's small hands holding the card I'd sent. Imagine him smiling, maybe asking his parents a question they wouldn't want to answer. But that wasn't my burden anymore. My steps along the path were my own, and each one was steady. It was a knock at the door that broke the new rhythm of my days. A hesitant knock, followed by the crunch of shoes on gravel shifting weight. When I opened the door, Claire stood there, her scarf arranged just so. Daniel behind her with his hands shoved into his coat pockets. They both looked smaller than I remembered, less certain. Claire cleared her throat and said they had been thinking about how things happened, about what was said and what wasn't. Daniel's voice was low when he admitted he didn't know why he hadn't stopped it. He said he thought I would always fix things. They both used the words, "We miss you." Claire said the house didn't feel the same. I stood in the doorway, listening. Their words weren't lies, but they weren't truth either. They missed the scaffolding, the silent hand, the endless patching. They missed the ease of not having to notice what was holding everything together. I let the silence between us stretch long enough that I could hear the sea in the distance, the waves pounding against the shore. Finally, I shook my head. "This is home?" I said, gesturing to the cottage behind me. Claire blinked. "But you're alone," she said, confusion slipping through her polish. I smiled gently. "Yes, and for the first time. That feels like enough." Daniel's mouth parted as if to argue, then closed again. I stepped back slightly, offered them tea if they wished to sit, but told them clearly I would not be returning. I would not be rescuing. I was not angry, but I would not erase what had happened. Claire's lips pressed together. Daniel dropped his eyes, and after a moment, they turned back down the path. I watched from the doorway as they climbed into their car, headlights flaring against the winter air. When the sound of the engine faded, the silence that remained did not feel empty. It felt whole. I poured myself tea and set 2 cups on the table, one for me and one for no one, or perhaps for someone not yet here. Someone who would come not to take, but simply to sit. I let the warmth seep into my hands, into my chest, into the parts of me that had been cold for so long. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be called, waiting to be needed, waiting to be asked to vanish politely into usefulness. I was simply myself. That evening, I opened the top drawer of the dresser and lifted out the navy dress Henry had loved, the one I wore on our last Christmas together. I pressed it against my chest. Not to wear, but to remember there had once been a woman who belonged to herself, who baked because she loved to, who laughed without apology, who lived not in the shadows of service, but in the center of her own light. She had been buried in silence, but she was not gone. She was here in this room, breathing, free. The days that followed stretched out like clean linen, uncreased by demands. I began to notice small things I had long forgotten, the way morning light shifts from gray to gold, how tea tastes sharper when you aren't drinking it in a rush, the quiet pride that comes from baking bread for no one but yourself. I started walking the coastal trail most afternoons, sketching the rocks and waves in a small notebook I had bought years ago but never opened. The salt air filled me with something that felt dangerously close to joy. Their messages slowed, then stopped. The silence that once terrified me now felt like shelter. I thought often about the bills I had canceled, the endless small rescues no one had seen. I didn't feel cruel for stopping. I felt fair. For years, I had believed kindness meant never drawing a boundary, but what I called kindness had only been fear. Fear of being unwanted. Fear of being erased. I finally understood that being erased is worse when you stay and let it happen. Leaving was not the punishment Claire claimed. It was the only way back to myself. Then one morning, as I walked through town, I passed a travel agency. In the window was a poster of Florence, the dome of the cathedral glowing in evening light. My heart stuttered with recognition. I remembered the list in the back of my notebook. Written in a younger hand, visit Florence. Take a watercolor class. See the ocean in winter. A list of small dreams I had once buried beneath everyone else's needs. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold pressing against my face, and whispered aloud, "Start tomorrow." And so I did. I signed up for a watercolor class in the next town over. The teacher was a woman with gray streaked hair and a laugh that filled the studio. We painted bowls of fruit, rooftops, waves. My hands shook at first, but then steadied, as if they remembered something I had forgotten. For once, no one corrected me. No one sighed at my efforts. No one implied I was doing it wrong. Each stroke was mine, imperfect and alive. At night, I lit candles in the cottage and read books I had once set aside for lack of time. I cooked meals with too much rosemary, just the way I liked. Without hearing Claire insist it needed garlic, I let the radio play softly in the background, not to drown out tension, but to fill the air with music I chose. Slowly, I began to feel the weight of years lifting, not in one dramatic sweep, but in steady layers, as if my soul were finally exhaling after holding its breath for decades. It was in one of those evenings, while painting the horizon from memory, that I realized something I had always thought real love meant proving myself indispensable. But indispensable is just another word for replaceable. Real love doesn't need proof. It sees you as you are, not for what you provide. That truth settled into me like warmth after winter. When the snow melted and the first signs of spring appeared, I received one last envelope. This time, it was postmarked in another city, and the handwriting was familiar. Ethan again. Another watercolor, this time of a sun rising over a field. Beneath it, in his blocky letters, were the words, "I hope you're happy. Love." Ethan. I pressed the paper to my chest and smiled. Not with sorrow, but with quiet gratitude. Somewhere, something had reached through. Perhaps not to Daniel, perhaps not to Claire, but to the child who had once left me out of a crayon drawing because he didn't know where I fit. Now, he knew enough to say he hoped I was happy. And I was. For the first time, I truly was. So this is what I leave with you. Never let your worth be measured by what you do for others, or by how quietly you can vanish for their comfort. Love is not the absence of boundaries, and sacrifice without respect is not devotion. It is disappearance. Choose to be seen. Choose to belong first to yourself. If this story touched you, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here.